Imagine yourself standing in the marble corridors of a Macedonian palace, about to witness one of the most disturbing wedding ceremonies in antiquity. The linen robes scratch at your skin as you watch a woman adjust the golden diadem upon her brow, a crown that marks her as queen. Her hands tremble, not with fear, but with rage she must swallow like bitter wine. Through the marble columns of Pella, nobles gather in the courtyard below, their voices rising in celebration of what they believe to be her triumph. But you know the truth. You are watching Arsinoe II, one of the most formidable women of the ancient world, as she weds her own half-brother. He is called Thunderbolt for his ruthless ambition, and he stands beside her, arm locked around her waist, his grip too tight, his smile too sharp. The crown he placed upon her head feels more like a shackle than an honor. He has promised safety for her sons, promised to recognize them as heirs to the throne he seized. Yet his eyes betray the hunger that has already driven him to murder rivals and claim these lands. What he truly desires is not a wife, but the removal of threats, her children from her first marriage. The priests chant in Greek, calling upon Zeus and Hera to bless this union. How ironic, those divine siblings whose marriage poets sang of, while everyone pretends not to see the disgust in her eyes. This is not the first time she has been traded like a jewel to cement alliances. At 15, her father married her to Lysimachus, a man old enough to be her grandfather. Now, at 40, she is once again reduced to currency. The nobles toast with wine, but to her it tastes like ash. She smiles, yet inside she is already planning. For 25 years she has navigated the deadly currents of Hellenistic politics. She knows survival demands not just beauty or birthright, but cunning, patience, and the will to do whatever the gods demand. As her new husband raises his cup, she notices her eldest son, Ptolemy, absent, too wise to walk into this trap. His absence may yet save his life, while hers balances on a knife's edge. The irony is cruel. Arsinoe, daughter of the great Ptolemy Soter, the man who carried Alexander the Great's body from Babylon and carved out his own empire, has become exactly what her enemies mock all royal women for being, a pawn in the games of men. But they forget what happens when a pawn crosses the board. The ceremony ends with kisses that taste like poison, with promises as fragile as broken pottery. Tonight, Macedonia will celebrate its new queen, while she lies beside a man who sees her as nothing more than a stepping stone to legitimacy. Yet he has no idea whom he has truly married. He does not know she carries the blood of Alexander's successors, that she has outlived and outmaneuvered courts far more treacherous than his. Already, she is weaving the web that will either save her or destroy them both. Before we uncover this forgotten tale of survival and betrayal in the shadows of empires, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history's most powerful dynasties, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts below. I love hearing where in the world you're tuning in from as we piece together the price of power and the women who paid it. The story of Arsinoe II does not begin with love or even desire, but with the cold calculations of empire. Born around 316 BCE in the shining new city of Alexandria, she entered a world where bloodline was both privilege and prison. Her father, Ptolemy I Soter, once a trusted general of Alexander the Great, had claimed Egypt as his prize from the chaos of conquest. In the marble halls of the royal palace, young Arsinoe learned early that her beauty and body were not her own. They belonged to the dynasty. She grew up speaking Greek in the palace, Egyptian among the servants, and watching the priests of Isis and Osiris perform rituals older than the pyramids. In Egypt, the king was not only a ruler but a god, and gods had their own laws. Laws that sanctioned sibling marriage, sanctified by myth and tradition. To Greeks it was a scandal, but to Egyptians it was divine. At 15, her father arranged her marriage to Lysimachus, the aging king of Thrace, as part of a grand political bargain. To the young girl, the veteran warrior must have seemed half legend, half monster, his body scarred by 100 battles, his hand the same one that once held Alexander's stirrup. Their wedding in Sardis was a glittering spectacle, nobles from across the Greek world, golden halls, and lamps that made her diadem blaze like fire. She was radiant, but beneath the robes and jewels, her fear was carefully hidden. Lysimachus, like every man she would ever marry, saw not a wife but an alliance, not a girl but a weapon. And so began the life of Arsinoe II, queen, survivor, and strategist in a world where power demanded everything, and mercy demanded nothing. This was no union of hearts, it was a union of armies. Not a romance, but a treaty etched in flesh and blood. As Arsinoe raised the ceremonial cup to her lips, the wine tasted like her future, bitter, intoxicating, and laced with danger. The wedding feast stretched on for 3 days. Poets compared her beauty to Helen of Troy and her fidelity to Penelope. Musicians plucked harps and flutes, dancers spun across the marble floors, and nobles from across the empire toasted the bride and groom. Yet beneath the revelry lay the grim truth. Arsinoe was no longer just a princess of Egypt. She was now queen of Thrace, thrust into the ruthless arena of Hellenistic power. Her husband, Lysimachus, had ruled for over 20 years, but his throne was precarious. To the north, Thracian tribes pressed against his borders. To the east, Seleucus eyed Anatolia with restless ambition. To the south, rival Diadochi circled like vultures, waiting for weakness. Arsinoe entered this world as both ornament and pawn, but she quickly learned her first great lesson. Survival required far more than beauty. It required reading every shift of power, knowing when to advance and when to retreat, when to speak and when silence itself was a weapon. She watched her husband's courtiers like a hawk, learning to decipher the smallest gestures of loyalty and betrayal. Within a year she bore him a son, Ptolemy, in 299 BC. 2 more soon followed, Lysimachus in 297 and Philip in 294. Each child strengthened her position, each one a bargaining chip in the deadly contest of succession. But Lysimachus already had an heir, Agathocles, the son of his first marriage. As Arsinoe's children grew, whispers spread through the palace. Who would inherit Thrace, the elder son born of a commoner, or the younger princes born of Egyptian royalty? Factions formed, courtiers schemed, and servants muttered of the queen's ambitions. Arsinoe quickly understood the precariousness of her position. She was not just a queen, she was a foreign queen. Her loyalty was suspect, her children regarded as dangerous threats to the established order. The same nobles who once celebrated her arrival now studied every word she spoke, every gesture she made, searching for evidence of conspiracy. Imagine her then, a young woman in her 20s, far from home, with 3 small children to protect. Every smile she offered was met with suspicion, every alliance carried hidden daggers. Her father had staked Egypt's prestige on this marriage. Failure would weaken not just her, but the entire Ptolemaic dynasty. So Arsinoe adapted. She bought loyalty with Egyptian gold, won over court ladies with gifts, and surrounded herself with philosophers and poets who praised her wisdom and beauty. She honored the local gods while discreetly maintaining her own Egyptian rights. Slowly, carefully, she built a circle of influence independent of her husband. The decisive moment came in 283 BCE, when her eldest son, Ptolemy, turned 16. By Greek custom, he was now old enough to be considered an heir. The question could no longer be avoided: who would succeed the aging Lysimachus? The king was 73, his hair white, his step unsteady. He had ruled longer than Alexander the Great had lived, but his mind remained sharp. His choice was perilous: back his eldest son, Agathocles, and risk alienating his powerful Egyptian allies, or elevate Arsinoe's sons, and risk civil war with Agathocles' faction. What happened next has been debated for centuries. Some say Arsinoe seduced her husband into eliminating his rival. Others believe she merely laid out the political realities with ruthless clarity. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. What we know is this: in 283 BC, Agathocles was accused of treason. The charges rested on flimsy evidence: intercepted letters, suspicious meetings, testimonies from witnesses who may have been bribed. Yet in the brutal world of Hellenistic politics, suspicion was often enough. Within days, Agathocles was executed by order of his father. The court reeled. Agathocles had been popular among the nobles, a proven commander who had fought beside his father for decades. His death secured Arsinoe's sons as heirs, but it came at a terrible cost. The kingdom split into factions, the old guard whispering of sorcery, blaming the foreign queen who, in their eyes, had bewitched their king and destroyed his bloodline. The whispers grew sharper, more venomous. Courtiers called Arsinoe a second Medea, a woman fated to poison everything she touched in her hunger for power. And as the court tore itself apart, the kingdom's enemies closed in. Seleucus I, the last surviving general of Alexander, marched against Lysimachus' eastern territories. Thracian tribes pushed harder at the northern borders. Pirates descended on the coast, emboldened by a kingdom distracted by its own civil war. In 281 BCE, the storm finally broke. Seleucus invaded Anatolia with a vast army, claiming vengeance for the murdered Agathocles. Despite his age, Lysimachus rode to war one last time. At Corupedium, two men in their 70s, both relics of Alexander's generation, faced each other across the battlefield. The clash was brutal but brief. Lysimachus' forces, weakened by years of division, collapsed under Seleucus' onslaught. The old king himself was cut down, pierced by a dozen spears. His body fell with his kingdom, Thrace crumbling like a house built on sand. Arsinoe, widowed at just 35, stood on a knife's edge. She had 3 sons to protect but no army left to defend them. Thrace dissolved around her, generals defected, and nobles sought vengeance. Seleucus' forces closed in on the capital. But Arsinoe had not survived 2 decades of intrigue by surrendering. Even as news of her husband's death spread, she was already gathering treasure, summoning loyal retainers, and plotting her escape. The queen who had once entered Sardis in a gilded bridal litter now fled like a hunted fugitive. Picture her caravan slipping through the night, torches flickering, hoofbeats muffled by sand. Arsinoe rode with her sons, Ptolemy, now 17, Lysimachus, 15, and Philip, 12. No longer princes, they were refugees dressed in rough wool, leaving behind a kingdom in flames. Seleucus' men hunted their supporters, executing some, enslaving others. Cities that once welcomed her now flung open their gates to her enemies. Yet fate turned quickly. Seleucus himself would not live to savor victory. Her half-brother, Ptolemy Ceraunus, son of their father's first marriage, long exiled at Seleucus' court, betrayed his benefactor. At the very moment Seleucus prepared to cross into Europe, Ceraunus struck, assassinating him and seizing the throne of Macedonia. The last of Alexander's generals was dead, cut down not by a peer, but by an ambitious youth. News reached Arsinoe as she sheltered on the Aegean coast. Her half-brother, long overlooked and humiliated, was now king of Macedonia, and he sent her a marriage proposal. His messengers spoke of reconciliation, of uniting the blood of Ptolemy I, of securing her son's inheritance. He promised to recognize them as heirs, to restore the legacy Lysimachus had lost. Arsinoe listened with a face of stone. She had heard such words before. Promises of safety, loyalty, protection, all of them crumbled when power demanded sacrifice. But she also knew she had little choice. Refusal meant exile and poverty, her sons growing up as beggars at foreign courts. Acceptance meant risking everything on the hope that family ties could outweigh ambition. At 40, Arsinoe was no naive girl. She knew she was stepping into a trap. Yet for her children's sake, she agreed. Before departing, she sent her eldest son, Ptolemy, into safe exile, a desperate safeguard against the disaster she feared. The wedding was staged in Pella, ancient heart of Macedonia, where Alexander himself had once walked. Ceraunus spared no expense, draping the palace in purple and gold, summoning priests to bless the union. To Egyptians, a sibling marriage echoed divine precedent, Isis and Osiris, the sacred pair who bound the cosmos together. But to Greeks, the match reeked of desperation, a violation of nature itself. The feast lasted 3 days, but the honeymoon ended in hours. On their wedding night, Ceraunus revealed his true intent. Arsinoe had not married a protector but an executioner. His men stormed the chambers where her younger sons slept. Lysimachus, 15, and Philip, 12, were dragged from their beds and butchered before their mother's eyes. Their blood stained the palace floors where Alexander once played as a child. Arsinoe's screams echoed through Pella, a sound the palace would never forget. Yet grief could not defeat her. Even as her sons' bodies were carried away, Arsinoe's mind turned to survival. She disguised herself in rough wool, her diadem replaced by a servant's headscarf. A slave woman who resembled her acted as a decoy, buying her precious hours. Slipping through the night, aided by servants, sympathizers, and smugglers, she escaped Serranus' grasp. Soldiers scoured the countryside, but Arsinoe vanished into the shadows. Her destination was Samothrace, the sacred island where the mysteries of the great gods offered sanctuary. No king dared violate its shrines. There, amid the ancient temples, Arsinoe found temporary refuge. She was 40 years old, thrice married, mother of 3 sons, 2 dead, 1 in exile. She had been queen of Egypt, queen of Thrace, and now she was a fugitive clinging to survival. But Arsinoe was not finished. Her last hope lay across the sea, in Alexandria, where her younger brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, ruled as pharaoh. If she could reach him, if she could persuade him to take her in, she might yet turn tragedy into triumph. The voyage was perilous. Serranus warships prowled the north, pirates infested the south. Disguised as a merchant's wife, at times as a pilgrim, Arsinoe slipped through unnoticed. When at last she sailed into Alexandria's great harbor, the city of her birth, her fate hung in the balance. Ptolemy II, a scholar king and cautious ruler, awaited her. To him, Arsinoe was both sister and rival, a survivor hardened by betrayal and loss. She carried danger with her, but also opportunity. Their reunion would change the destiny of Egypt itself. The negotiations that followed were precarious. Arsinoe sought sanctuary, but she also demanded a position equal to her experience and ambition. She could not resign herself to a quiet exile, nor accept life as a dependent relative. She had been a queen, a mother, and a master player in the ruthless game of dynastic politics. To fade into obscurity was unthinkable. The solution, when it emerged, was both audacious and shocking. Ptolemy II was already married to Arsinoe I, who had borne him children but lacked the political sharpness required of a true partner in rule. If he were to set her aside and wed his sister instead, he would gain not only a wife but a co-ruler, someone who understood the intricacies of Hellenistic politics better than anyone alive. In Egypt, the idea was not without precedent. For 3,000 years, pharaohs had occasionally married their sisters, echoing the sacred union of the gods themselves. Isis and Osiris, the divine siblings, ruled the underworld together. Such marriages were not seen as incestuous, but as holy bonds that upheld the cosmic balance. But the Ptolemies were also Greek, and to Greek sensibilities, sibling marriage was abhorrent, a violation of nature and a threat to moral order. No Ptolemaic ruler had yet dared to cross this line. Ptolemy too knew that in marrying Arsinoe, he would ignite scandal and set a precedent that could never be reversed. Yet he also recognized the power it offered, the chance to claim divine legitimacy, to transform his dynasty from foreign conquerors into true Egyptian pharaohs. When the engagement was announced, the Greek world erupted in outrage and fascination. Philosophers debated its morality. Statesmen calculated the political implications. Some dismissed it as evidence of Egyptian decadence, others saw it as a masterstroke of propaganda. The wedding, staged in Memphis at the Temple of Ptah, was designed to silence doubt with spectacle. The rituals were purely Egyptian, steeped in antiquity. Arsinoe, now 41, stood beside her 26-year-old brother in full regalia. She wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, while he bore the crook and flail, symbols of divine kingship. Hymns older than the pyramids were sung, declaring the pair gods on earth, heirs to Isis and Osiris themselves. The Greeks of Alexandria were scandalized, but they were also awed. Never before had the Ptolemies embraced Egypt's sacred traditions so fully. From that moment on, they were not simply Hellenistic rulers of Egypt, they were Egypt. The marriage reshaped both their lives. Ptolemy too became Philadelphus, the brother-lover. Arsinoe became Philadelphus, the sister-wife. Together they were worshipped as Theoi Philadelphoi, the sibling gods. But this transformation was more than ceremonial. Arsinoe poured her experience into governance. She accompanied Ptolemy on tours of the land, helped manage Egypt's diverse peoples, and strengthened Alexandria's status as a center of learning. Above all, she shaped Egypt's foreign policy with the ruthless clarity of one who had survived decades of betrayal. She urged swift, decisive action where others hesitated, reminding her brother husband that in the brutal world of Hellenistic kingship, fortune favored those who struck first. Her counsel soon proved crucial during the outbreak of the First Syrian War. Where Ptolemy hesitated, Arsinoe urged boldness. Antiochus is weak, she warned. Strike before he gathers strength. Her words carried the weight of bitter memory. She had seen too many rulers destroyed by hesitation. Though the marriage produced no children, it did not matter. Arsinoe had already sacrificed her youth, her first marriage, and even her sons to reach this pinnacle. Now, in the twilight of her life, she had achieved something greater than motherhood. She had forged a dynasty's divine identity. Yet the triumph came at a cruel price. She had been forced into incestuous unions twice. She had endured betrayal, exile, and the murder of her children. In her quest to protect her family, she became a symbol rather than a woman, a goddess enthroned, but a mother bereaved. Her legacy would outlast her. Future Ptolemaic rulers would follow her example, marrying siblings to maintain divine legitimacy. The tradition would reach its height with Cleopatra VII, who wielded her sacred ancestry against Rome itself. But every such marriage carried the echo of Arsinoe's sacrifice, the blood of her murdered sons staining the roots of the dynasty's power. As the sun set over Alexandria, the divine couple performed their sacred rites while the city thrived under their protection. But in the silence of memory, the laughter of two lost boys haunted the palace gardens, a reminder of the terrible cost their mother had paid to turn tragedy into immortality. The war that followed proved her counsel correct. Egyptian armies surged through Palestine and southern Syria, reclaiming territories lost for generations. Cities long crushed under Seleucid taxation welcomed the Ptolemaic troops as liberators. Arsinoe herself joined several of these campaigns, her presence inspiring soldiers and ensuring the victories were secured. Yet her genius went beyond strategy. She grasped something her rivals often ignored, the power of narrative, of shaping how rule was remembered. Under her guidance, the royal court blossomed into a cultural hub unmatched since the days of Pericles in Athens. Poets such as Theocritus were commissioned to craft verses portraying the royal couple as divine, likening them to Zeus and Hera. Even as Zeus, king of the gods, loves Hera, his sister wife, Theocritus wrote, so does Ptolemy love his bride. The message was deliberate. If the king of gods could marry his sister, then mortal pharaohs surely could as well. Arsinoe skillfully balanced Greek and Egyptian sensibilities. Along the Nile, temple reliefs depicted her and Ptolemy as Isis and Osiris, divine siblings whose union upheld cosmic order. Hieroglyphs framed their marriage not as foreign innovation but as timeless continuity with pharaonic tradition. Her influence extended into every corner of court life. She reorganized the royal household, introduced new ceremonies that emphasized the divine status of the ruling pair, and poured resources into the great library, attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean. She funded temples and grand public buildings that proclaimed Ptolemaic authority. Perhaps most crucially, she carefully integrated Ptolemy II's children from his first marriage into the new dynastic order. The crown prince, the future Ptolemy III, was still a boy when his father divorced his mother to marry Arsinoe. Rather than treat him as a rival, Arsinoe honored and nurtured him. She reminded him, "You are the future of this dynasty. Your father and I are but guardians of the throne until you are ready. Remember, power is not inherited, it is earned day by day." These lessons, rooted in her own bitter experience, shaped the young prince into the ruler he would become. Over time, Arsinoe took on roles once reserved for kings. She sat in council meetings where her voice carried equal weight to generals and administrators. She negotiated with foreign envoys, her fluency in languages invaluable. She even performed sacred rituals usually reserved for the pharaoh. The transformation was extraordinary. The pawn in her father's political schemes had risen to become a sovereign force whose influence rivaled any ruler in the Mediterranean. Foreign kings sought her favor, scholars dedicated works to her, and Egyptians worshipped her as a living goddess. Her greatest legacy, however, was the model she created for future Ptolemaic queens. Before her, royal women were largely confined to motherhood and diplomacy. Arsinoe changed everything. She pioneered what historians would later call Ptolemaic queenship, blending Egyptian divine kingship with Hellenistic authority. Later queens, including Cleopatra, would build upon the foundations she laid. The irony was striking. The woman once trapped in incestuous marriages, used as a tool of male ambition, had transformed that very practice into a pillar of dynastic power. She had forged chains into crowns. By her 50s, she began reflecting on her legacy. Though childless, she had founded something far more enduring, an institution, a tradition of queenship that survived beyond her life. She even established her own cult in her lifetime, temples, priesthoods, and festivals dedicated to her as a goddess. These were not empty vanities but deliberate acts to secure her memory in Egypt's sacred order. Her death came in 270 BCE at age 46. The cause is unknown: illness, poison, or simply exhaustion. What mattered was not how she died, but how she lived. Her funeral was a spectacle fit for a pharaoh. Envoys from across the Mediterranean attended, poets recited verses, priests conducted rites in many tongues, and Egyptians mourned their divine queen. Ptolemy II, devastated, enshrined her cult forever. She was deified as Arsinoë Philadelphus, the brother-loving goddess, her temples and images enduring for centuries. More importantly, the traditions she established lived on. Every future Ptolemaic sibling marriage honored her example. What began as her survival strategy became the dynasty's defining hallmark. Her story carried a tragic irony. Victimized by dynastic marriage, she turned it into a weapon of power. Men forced her into incest, yet she made it the source of her sovereignty. Centuries later, when Julius Caesar encountered Cleopatra, he marveled at her divine confidence. The answer was simple: Cleopatra was the heir to Arsinoe's model of queenship. Arsinoe II had begun as a pawn but remade herself into a goddess queen. She sacrificed peace, family, and humanity itself, but in return she achieved something no woman before her had: authority by merit as well as birth. Her legacy endured through coins, temples, sibling marriage rituals, and the very idea of a queen as a ruler in her own right. She had been the victim who became the goddess, the pawn who became the queen, the woman who proved that even in a patriarchal age, intelligence and willpower could transform chains into crowns.